CEO outside his office and said, "Daddy, they took Mommy to court," but he didn't even know he had a daughter. The morning had started like any other for Evan Miller. As the CEO of one of Manhattan's most powerful real estate firms, his days were carefully structured, saturated with meetings, calls, and decisions that moved millions. He walked briskly along the sidewalk outside his glass-clad headquarters, dressed in a pale tailored suit that contrasted with his dark brown hair and deep-set brown eyes. His assistant trailed a few steps behind, listing calendar updates, but Evan barely heard her. His focus was glued to the screen of his phone as he reviewed a contract revision sent from overseas. His world, at that moment, was pure business, efficient, logical, and entirely under control. Until he heard a small voice say something that stopped him cold. "Daddy, they took Mommy to court." He froze mid-step. The voice hadn't come from his assistant or anyone passing by. It was soft, unsure, but distinct. Slowly, he lowered his phone and turned his head toward the sound. Standing just a few feet away was a little girl, no older than 7, with wavy blonde hair and large brown eyes filled with something too heavy for someone her age. She wore a light pink dress and clutched the hand of a smaller girl, maybe 4 years old, dressed in yellow with bright blue eyes and curls that framed her cherubic face. Evan stared at them, confused, then looked around as if this were some kind of prank. The sidewalk was busy, people passed without paying attention. But the girls didn't move. The older one just looked up at him with unbearable seriousness. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cautious. The older girl took a small breath and repeated, "Mommy's in court. She's in trouble. We came to find you." He shook his head slightly, frowning. "I don't have children," he said automatically. "I think you've made a mistake." The girl didn't flinch. Instead, she carefully reached into a small pink backpack and pulled out a folded photograph. She stepped forward, raising it with both hands. Evan hesitated, but curiosity overtook him. He took the photo and looked at it. His heart dropped. It was Rachel. Her hair was shorter, her eyes older, but there was no doubt. It was her. The woman he had once loved, desperately, stupidly, and whom he hadn't seen in 7 years. The breakup had been sudden and final. He thought she'd moved on, disappeared into another life. And she had, just not in the way he imagined. "She's my mom," the girl said softly. "And I'm Sophie. This is Lucy. She's my little sister." Evan's grip tightened on the photo. His mind raced. If Rachel had a daughter, this daughter, and if she was 7 years old. His eyes returned to Sophie. Her features. Her gaze. There was no denying it now. She looked like him. The shape of her eyes. Her chin. The set of her mouth. All the signs were there, undeniable and overwhelming. He staggered back slightly, stunned. "You're saying I'm your father?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Sophie nodded. "Mom never told you." "I think she was scared. But she always said your name. I knew who you were when I saw you in the picture on the building." He remembered the real estate campaign. His face plastered across billboards for a new luxury development. That was how Sophie found him. "I didn't know," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I didn't even know." Sophie seemed to hesitate, then added, "Lucy's dad is my stepdad. He's the reason Mommy's in court. He wants to take Lucy away from her. He hurts Mommy. Sometimes us too. So we ran. And when the police came, they took Mommy. And we didn't know what else to do. So we came here." Evan felt the world shift beneath him. A moment ago, he was a man of logic and numbers. Now, he was standing face to face with a daughter he never knew existed, and a frightened little girl who wasn't even his, but whose wide blue eyes clung to him like he was their only hope. He looked at both girls. They were tired. They had likely walked a long way. Their shoes were scuffed. Their clothes, though clean, looked worn and stretched from too much use. Sophie was still standing tall, trying to be brave. Lucy leaned into her older sister, eyes flicking between Evan and the crowds behind them. He couldn't leave them there. Whatever the truth was, whatever anger or betrayal he might feel toward Rachel, none of that mattered right now. These girls needed help. He bent down slightly, his voice gentler now. "Do you want to come inside with me? We'll get you something to eat, and we'll figure this out. Okay?" Sophie gave a small nod. She didn't smile. She didn't show relief. But she trusted him enough to follow. As he led them into the building, the security guard stared, stunned, but said nothing. Evan didn't explain. He couldn't. His mind was a hurricane. His past had just walked straight into his future, and brought with it two little girls who were about to change everything. Inside the towering glass lobby of Miller and Company, everything was still and pristine, too pristine for two tired little girls and a man who suddenly felt like his life had broken free from the rails. Evan walked swiftly through the security checkpoint, the older girl, Sophie, at his side, clutching the hand of her sister Lucy, who lagged behind with sleepy steps. The marble floors echoed under their shoes as they made their way to the private elevator reserved for executive access. No one stopped him. No one asked questions. He was Evan Miller, no one questioned him. But for the first time in years, he wished someone would. He needed someone to help him process what had just happened. The elevator ride was silent. Sophie didn't ask where they were going, and Lucy leaned against the wall, blinking slowly like she might fall asleep standing up. Evan glanced down at them and realized they must not have eaten. Or slept. Or felt safe in a long time. A stab of guilt cut through him, irrational but overwhelming. He didn't know these girls, but somehow, they were his responsibility now. At least one of them was. And the other had no one else. They entered his executive suite on the top floor. It was sleek, modern, and completely devoid of anything resembling childhood. The walls were lined with glass shelves and awards, the furniture was all steel and leather, and the only sound was the quiet hum of the HVAC. Evan had built it to impress board members, not to comfort children. He suddenly hated it. "Come sit," he said quietly, motioning toward a couch that looked far too formal for two children to rest on. Still, Sophie obeyed, helping Lucy up beside her and brushing the younger girl's hair back with careful fingers. That simple gesture, gentle, practiced, made Evan's throat tighten. She'd been doing this far too long. She shouldn't have to be a mother to her own sister. "I'll get food," he said quickly and stepped into the break area, rummaging through the kitchenette. He found bottled water, crackers, and a few snack bars, not much, but enough for now. He returned and handed the water to Sophie, who took it and gave Lucy the first drink. She didn't even open her own until Lucy had finished half the bottle. Evan sat across from them, elbows on his knees, trying to speak calmly even as his mind raced. "I need to understand what happened," he said. "Can you tell me everything from the beginning?" Sophie nodded. She looked older than 7 now, calmer than most adults might be in her position. "Mommy was trying to leave," she began, her voice soft. "Greg, Lucy's dad, he started being mean when Lucy was still a baby. Yelling. Throwing things. Sometimes hitting Mommy. Then he started yelling at us too. I tried to hide Lucy when he was angry." Evan felt a slow burn rise in his chest. He clenched his jaw but stayed silent. "Mom tried to get help. She called someone once, but Greg found out. He broke her phone. She didn't call again. He said if she ever left, he'd take Lucy and say Mommy was crazy. So we stayed. She was scared. But one day he pushed her too hard, and I screamed really loud. A neighbor came and called the police. Sophie paused, looked down at her hands. They came. But Greg told them it was all lies. Mommy was crying and couldn't talk right. So they took her. Said she might be dangerous. They said Lucy should go with Greg, but Mommy begged them not to. She told me to run. So I ran. I grabbed Lucy and left before they could take us. I remembered your name. I saw you once on a billboard downtown. So I found your office. Evan couldn't move. Couldn't breathe, for a moment. The image of a 7-year-old grabbing her baby sister and fleeing into the streets of New York was more than heartbreaking, it was horrifying. He leaned back, covering his mouth with one hand, the other gripping his knee so tightly his knuckles whitened. And Rachel, she never told me about you, he said finally. Sophie shrugged a little, but there was no blame in her voice. She wanted to. I think. But she always said you were too busy and important. And that if you knew, maybe you'd be mad. He didn't know what to say. Maybe he would have been angry. Maybe he wouldn't have believed it. Maybe Rachel had been right to fear his reaction, but none of it mattered now. I believe you, he said quietly. And I'm not mad. I'm trying to fix this. Sophie gave him a long look, like she was measuring the truth in his voice. Then, slowly, she nodded. Evan stood and pulled out his phone, pacing the room as he spoke to his assistant in a low, firm tone. I need our legal team. Now. Track down which court Rachel Carson is being held in. I want a family attorney on this case within the hour. And call Detective Harris. We'll need his connections. He hung up and looked back at the girls. Lucy was asleep now, curled against her sister. Sophie was still watching him, like she wasn't sure if the spell would break. I'm going to help your mom, he told her. And I'm going to help you. You don't have to do this alone anymore. For a moment, she didn't react. Then she leaned back on the couch, gently resting her head against Lucy's, and whispered, "Okay." It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was a beginning. And for Evan Miller, who had spent his life chasing control and power, it felt like the first real thing he'd done in years. The next few hours passed in a blur. Evan had faced billion-dollar negotiations, global mergers, and high-pressure boardroom standoffs, but none of them compared to the storm of emotion he was caught in now. His legal team arrived quickly, sensing the urgency in his voice, though none of them dared ask who the children were. Their professionalism couldn't hide the surprise in their eyes when they saw the two girls asleep on the couch in his office, one nestled into the other, both looking impossibly small against the backdrop of a world built for adults. Evan briefed them sharply, clearly, without letting his emotions surface too much. He explained that Rachel Carson, the mother of the children, had been taken into custody during a domestic disturbance. The stepfather, Greg Bennett, had filed for custody of Lucy, the younger child, and was using claims of instability to push Rachel out of the picture completely. Evan didn't share everything, not yet. He didn't mention that Sophie was his daughter, or that he had only just discovered her existence. That part felt too personal, too fragile, to give to anyone else just yet. By late afternoon, one of the firm's attorneys had located Rachel's hearing, family court, downtown, scheduled for the next morning. Rachel was still being held under temporary evaluation, not criminal charges, but Greg's legal team was moving fast to gain emergency custody of Lucy. The system, overwhelmed and imperfect, had bought into Greg's version of the story, for now. Evan stood at the wide windows of his office, looking down at the blur of yellow cabs and pedestrians below. His city, his kingdom, suddenly felt cold and distant. Behind him, the girls were still asleep, and the quiet sound of their breathing was the only thing anchoring him to the moment. He turned when he heard soft footsteps. Sophie had woken and was gently easing herself off the couch, trying not to disturb Lucy. She looked around and met his gaze. Her face was unreadable, serious beyond her years. "Is Mommy okay?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Evan walked over, crouching down so they were eye level. "She's okay. She's safe for now. We found her. She's still in custody, but we're going to court tomorrow to make sure she's not alone there." Sophie nodded slowly, and for the first time, a flicker of relief passed across her face. But it vanished just as quickly. "Greg lies," she said. "He makes things sound nice when people are listening. But then he changes." Evan felt anger rise again, slow and controlled. "You don't have to worry about him. I've hired people who will make sure he doesn't hurt your mom, or either of you, again." "Will you be there?" she asked suddenly. "At court?" "Of course," he said without hesitation. "I'll be sitting right behind your mom." There was a long pause. Then she looked away and murmured, "She's not perfect. But she tried. She really tried." Evan didn't answer right away. He thought of Rachel as he had last seen her, years ago, standing in the rain outside their apartment, her voice breaking as she told him she couldn't do this anymore. Back then, he had assumed it was over something trivial. A fight. A difference in ambition. He had no idea she'd been carrying the secret of a child. And now, standing here, hearing their daughter defend her, he realized just how little he'd understood. He reached out, gently placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "We all make mistakes. But trying to do the right thing still matters. That's why we're going to help her." The rest of the evening was quiet. Evan arranged for a private driver to take them to his apartment, a sleek high-rise on the Upper West Side that had always felt more like a museum than a home. But now, with the girls trailing behind him and their small voices echoing in the empty space, the walls felt less sterile. He showed them to the guest rooms and had his housekeeper prepare a warm meal. Lucy ate without much energy, but Sophie remained alert, watching everything, still not quite convinced that this safety was permanent. After dinner, while the girls were being settled in, Evan returned to his home office and stood staring at the fireplace. He held the photograph Sophie had given him earlier. Rachel looked tired in the image, but happy. Sophie as a baby was on her hip, smiling. He stared at the child's face, seeing his own eyes, his own mouth, and felt something shift inside him. A kind of silent grief for the years he'd missed. For the bedtime stories never told, the birthdays he hadn't attended, the scraped knees he hadn't soothed. He could never get that time back. But he could fight now. He picked up the phone and dialed Detective Harris directly. The man had helped him discreetly during corporate investigations before, background checks, private matters. But this time, Evan's voice was different. "I need you to dig into someone named Greg Bennett," he said. "Family court case. I want everything, records, complaints, ex-wives, restraining orders, anything. I don't care how small it looks. I'm protecting 2 children and their mother, and I won't let the wrong man win." After a long pause, Harris replied, "Understood. You'll have something by morning." Evan ended the call and stood in the silence of his office. His life had changed in a single afternoon. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't expected it. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't walk away from it either. In the next room, Sophie was finally asleep, curled next to her sister in a bed too big for them both. And for the first time in years, Evan Miller wasn't thinking about profit margins or market projections. He was thinking about how to keep 2 little girls safe. And how to earn the right to be called a father. The next morning came with a heavy, gray sky that hung over the city like a warning. Evan Miller stood at the window of his penthouse apartment, coffee in hand, watching the streets below begin to stir. The early light cast soft shadows through the tall windows, and the usual thrill he got from the Manhattan skyline was gone. Today wasn't about business. It wasn't about power or headlines or investment deals. It was about showing up, for someone he'd unknowingly abandoned, and for a woman who had been carrying the weight of too much for far too long. In the bedroom down the hall, the girls were waking slowly. Lucy whimpered once in her sleep, and Sophie, already half-dressed, moved instantly to her side. Evan watched from the doorway, unnoticed. The way Sophie comforted her sister was not something she had learned in school or in playgroups. It was something that came from necessity, from too many nights without protection, from being the only person Lucy could count on. It hurt to watch. A child that small should not have had to become someone's shield. After breakfast, they dressed quietly and left the apartment in Evan's car with his driver, heading downtown toward the family courthouse. He had already coordinated with his legal team. Rachel would be present in a hearing that would determine whether Lucy would be released into Greg's custody pending full custody litigation. The decision could be made in a matter of minutes if no one contested it, and until yesterday, there had been no one to stand in Rachel's defense. She had been painted as unstable, unfit, overwhelmed, without support. And it had nearly worked. As they pulled up to the courthouse, Evan glanced at Sophie in the rear seat. She was sitting very still, holding Lucy's hand tightly. Her face betrayed nothing, but her other hand trembled slightly in her lap. He reached out gently, palm up, and after a brief pause, she placed her hand in his. Neither of them said anything. But the gesture stayed. Inside the courthouse, everything smelled of old carpet and over-polished wood. Families sat on benches, lawyers whispered in corners, and bailiffs called names with dispassion. It was a place where futures were reshaped every hour, often without ceremony or compassion. Evan hated it immediately. Rachel was already in the small courtroom when they arrived. She sat at the defendant's table, looking tired and much thinner than he remembered. Her hair was tied back loosely, and she wore a simple blouse that looked borrowed. When she turned and saw Sophie and Lucy walk in, her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes welled up. She hadn't known if she'd ever see them again. Evan stepped forward, and for a moment Rachel looked stunned to see him there. Their eyes met, and there was a flash of history between them, grief, confusion, unfinished conversations. But none of that mattered right now. He gave her a slight nod. It was enough. The judge entered, a woman in her late 50s with a reputation for efficiency and little patience for dramatics. Judge Margaret Brooks. She called the case number, and the proceedings began. Greg sat at the other table, dressed in a suit, his face calm, confident. He didn't even look at Rachel. His attorney began speaking immediately, describing Rachel as mentally unstable, unwell, emotionally erratic, citing a single prior report from a neighbor and emphasizing her recent detainment as proof she was unfit to care for Lucy. He suggested emergency placement with Greg until further psychological evaluation could be completed. Rachel's court-appointed attorney began to object, but her voice was uncertain, and she stumbled over her words. Evan felt his anger rise. He stood. "Your Honor," he said firmly, and the judge glanced up over her glasses. "Mr. Miller, you are not on the docket to speak." "I know. But I request to be heard as a material party. My name is Evan Miller. I am the biological father of the older child, Sophie, and I am here today because the information presented about Rachel Carson is incomplete, misleading, and intentionally damaging." The courtroom shifted. Even Greg blinked in surprise. "I have known about Sophie for less than 24 hours, Evan continued, but I have already seen enough to know Rachel has been fighting alone for years. I have heard from our daughter about the emotional and physical abuse she and her sister have suffered in the home of Mr. Bennett. I have engaged legal counsel, private investigation, and offered my support as a co-parent. I am requesting the court deny temporary custody to Greg Bennett and instead consider granting joint guardianship of both children to Rachel Carson and myself until further review." There was silence in the room. The judge studied him carefully, her fingers tapping slowly against the wood of the bench. "Do you have documentation of paternity?" "We have initiated DNA testing. In the meantime, we are requesting a temporary protective arrangement. I am prepared to house both children in a secure environment, and I have the resources to support this family while investigations continue. Rachel looked down at the table, trying to contain her emotion. Her hands were shaking. Evan glanced over and saw Sophie clinging to Lucy in the front row, eyes wide but hopeful. The judge called for a brief recess. When she returned, she spoke with authority and clarity. In the interest of the children's safety and based on the evidence presented and the credible testimony of Mr. Miller, I am denying Mr. Bennett's petition for temporary custody. Effective immediately, the court grants temporary joint guardianship of both minors to Rachel Carson and Evan Miller. Mr. Bennett is issued a restraining order and may not have contact with either child until further review. Rachel let out a quiet, almost inaudible sob. Sophie turned and hugged Lucy tightly. Evan stood frozen for a moment, stunned not by the victory, but by the weight of it. He had just taken on the lives of two little girls, and something else entirely. A second chance. One he never thought he'd have. As the courtroom cleared, Rachel slowly approached him. She looked exhausted, and there were so many words waiting to be said between them. But she only managed one. "Thank you." He nodded. "We'll figure the rest out later. For now, you're going home with your daughters." And in that moment, it was clear, nothing would ever be the same again. The ride back to Evan's apartment that afternoon was unlike the one they had taken earlier. There was still a certain heaviness in the air, but it was no longer made of fear. It had been replaced by something fragile but real, hope. Rachel sat in the back seat next to her daughters, both of whom leaned against her as if their bodies instinctively remembered the comfort they had nearly lost. Sophie held Rachel's hand without letting go, while Lucy rested her head on her mother's lap and closed her eyes, the chaos of the courtroom finally catching up with her. Evan sat in the front seat, his thoughts tangled. The hearing had gone as well as it possibly could have, but he knew that what lay ahead wouldn't be simple. Legal guardianship was temporary. Investigations were still pending. And just because the judge had made a ruling didn't mean Rachel was safe from scrutiny or from Greg's manipulation. He also knew that emotionally, things were far more complex. These weren't just logistics. They were lives, traumas, relationships frozen in time and suddenly forced to thaw. When they arrived at the apartment, the girls immediately gravitated to the familiar space. Lucy headed straight for the soft blankets on the couch, while Sophie gently guided her mother toward the kitchen and asked, "Are you hungry?" The question, simple as it was, held layers beneath it. It wasn't just about food, it was about control, about reassurance, about finally being able to take care of someone who had always tried to take care of her. Rachel gave a weak smile and nodded. "A little," she said. Evan watched the interaction from the hallway, unsure whether to step in or give them space. Part of him still felt like an outsider, despite everything he had done in the past 24 hours. He had jumped into action, hired lawyers, challenged a custody battle, but now that things were quiet, he didn't know where he fit in this family. Rachel noticed his hesitation and walked over to him. "Thank you again," she said softly, her voice slightly hoarse. "I know I keep saying that, but I don't really have the words." He nodded. "You don't need to thank me. Not for this." She glanced around the apartment, her eyes lingering on the high ceilings, the view of the skyline, the elegant but now gently lived-in space. "This place, it doesn't feel cold," she said. "I thought it would." "It used to," Evan replied. "Before they came." Rachel smiled, and something softened between them. A shared understanding of what had been lost, and what might still be possible to recover. Over dinner, Rachel ate slowly, more to show the girls that she was okay than because she had any real appetite. Sophie stayed close, always glancing at her mother's plate, nudging her gently to finish her vegetables. Lucy, half asleep, leaned on Evan's arm while holding a spoon like a toy rather than a utensil. He didn't move her. He just let her rest. After the girls were put to bed, Rachel joined Evan in the living room. The city lights shimmered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the room was wrapped in a calm that had felt impossible just 24 hours earlier. She sat with her knees tucked under her, wearing one of the oversized sweaters Evan's housekeeper had found for her. He offered her a mug of tea and sat across from her, watching the steam rise between them. "I want to explain," she began, staring at her hands. "You don't have to," he said quickly, but she shook her head. "I do. You deserve that, at least." She took a breath and looked at him. "When I found out I was pregnant with Sophie, I panicked. We were already breaking apart, and I thought if I told you, you'd feel trapped. I didn't want to be someone who ruined your career, your life. So I left. I thought I was doing the right thing. And for a while, maybe I believed it." He said nothing. He couldn't. Every word was like a cut, clean, honest, and long overdue. Then Greg came into the picture. He seemed kind at first, dependable. He helped me raise Sophie, treated her like his own. But things changed after Lucy was born. He grew cold. Controlling. He drank. And then the yelling started. Then worse. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. I tried to leave more times than I can count. But every time, he threatened to take Lucy. He said no one would believe me. That I was already unstable, a single mom with no family. And maybe I believed that too. Evan finally spoke. "You should have told me." "I know," she said quietly. "But I didn't know how to fix it once it was broken. I just tried to survive." They sat in silence for a long while after that. Not uncomfortable silence, but the kind that follows truth. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that could lead there. "I'm not going to disappear," Evan said finally. "I don't want this to be temporary." Rachel nodded. "I don't want it to be either." They didn't make promises. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring. But they both understood that something real had been placed in their hands now. And they couldn't drop it. As midnight approached, Evan checked on the girls one last time. Sophie was curled around Lucy protectively, both breathing softly in sync. He stood at the doorway for a long time, and when he finally walked away, he didn't feel like a stranger anymore. He felt like he belonged. Not because of blood or law, but because he had chosen to stay. Morning came with a soft golden light pouring through the tall windows of Evan's apartment, but the warmth of the sun did little to calm the uneasy energy that had settled in the air. It wasn't tension exactly, it was more like a deep, collective exhaustion. The kind that comes not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much for too long. The girls woke slowly. Sophie helped Lucy brush her hair while Rachel stood quietly by the kitchen counter, staring into her tea as if it might offer answers to questions she still hadn't found the courage to ask. Evan watched all of this from a quiet distance, unsure how to fit into this family rhythm that had formed without him, but desperate to be a part of it anyway. He spent the morning on the phone with his legal team and Detective Harris. Overnight, Harris had uncovered several disturbing patterns in Greg Bennett's past: 2 prior relationships with allegations of emotional abuse, 1 restraining order that had been quietly dismissed, and a dismissed CPS report from 3 years ago that had been closed before a full investigation was conducted. It was enough to form a clear picture of a man who knew how to manipulate systems and people. Evan listened in silence, his jaw tight, then asked Harris to dig deeper. He wanted anything that could be used to permanently remove Greg from their lives. Meanwhile, Rachel tried to re-establish a sense of normalcy for the girls. She spent most of the morning sitting on the floor with Lucy, playing with blocks, her voice soft and patient as she named the colors and shapes. But even then, her eyes kept flicking to the door, to the phone, to Sophie, anywhere that might signal danger or another unexpected twist. Trauma had made her hyper-aware, alert to things no one should have to live in constant fear of. Sophie, too, carried the same weight, though she tried to hide it. She asked for reassurance in subtle ways: who would pick her up if they went out, who would hold the keys, whether the doors were locked. Later that day, a social worker from Family Services arrived for an in-home visit. It was routine under the court's order, but that didn't make it any less stressful. Evan answered the door, greeted her politely, and led her inside. Rachel sat straight-backed on the couch with Lucy in her lap, while Sophie sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. The social worker, a woman named Carla with a warm but firm presence, asked a long series of questions, about their routine, their meals, sleeping arrangements, school history, and the events leading up to the court hearing. Rachel answered with quiet dignity, never playing the victim, never dramatizing her experience, just telling the truth. Sophie, when asked, spoke clearly but with an edge of distance, as if she didn't want to say too much for fear it might be used against them later. Evan noticed and stepped in gently where needed, offering factual support without overshadowing Rachel's voice. After the social worker left, Rachel disappeared into the guest room and closed the door. Evan waited a few minutes before knocking lightly and stepping in. She was sitting on the bed, staring out the window. She didn't turn around when he entered. "I hate feeling inspected," she said. "Like they're measuring if I'm worth keeping my own children." He sat down beside her but didn't respond right away. He understood. There was no way to describe that feeling unless you'd been through it. "They don't know you," he said eventually. "But I do. And Sophie does. That matters more." Rachel turned to him, her eyes tired. "I keep thinking that maybe they'd be better off without me. You could raise them. Give them a safer life. Cleaner. Easier." Evan didn't hesitate. "Don't ever say that again. They don't just need safety. They need you." Lucy clings to you like you're her entire world. "Sophie would tear the walls down if someone tried to take you away. You don't see it because you've been too busy surviving, but they love you with everything they have. And so do I." The last part came out before he could stop it. Rachel blinked, her lips parting slightly in surprise. It wasn't a confession meant to complicate things. It was just the truth, simple, quiet, and raw. They sat in silence for a moment, and though she didn't say it back, she reached over and took his hand. That evening, they had dinner as a family. Not because it was planned, but because it felt necessary. The four of them sat around Evan's large table, once a sterile space for executives and catered lunches, now cluttered with mismatched cups and tiny forks. Lucy ate spaghetti with her hands. Sophie told a story from a book she remembered from kindergarten. Rachel laughed, really laughed, for the first time since she had arrived. And Evan sat back, watching all of it unfold like a man who had finally found the thing he hadn't known he'd been missing. Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Rachel and Evan stepped out onto the balcony. The city stretched before them, glittering and endless. The air was warm, but not heavy, and for once, the silence between them wasn't filled with things left unsaid. It was comfortable. "We're not out of this yet," she said softly. "Greg isn't going to give up." "I know," Evan replied. "But he doesn't get to win this time." She nodded, then looked at him with something different in her eyes. Not fear. Not apology. But trust. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," he said. "But we'll do it scared. Together." And in that quiet moment, as the city moved on far below them, they both realized something. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about rebuilding something worth living for. Something whole. Something lasting. The day of Greg Bennett's formal hearing arrived with the same overcast skies that had become all too familiar since this ordeal began. The morning felt tense from the moment everyone woke up. Even the girls, who had slowly started to settle into a rhythm of laughter and play, moved quietly through the apartment, picking at their breakfast and staying close to Rachel without asking why. Sophie didn't speak much, but her eyes followed Rachel and Evan everywhere they went, needing the reassurance of their presence. Lucy clung to her mother's hip, even refusing her favorite toy if it meant letting go. The weight of the day was something even the youngest could feel. Rachel dressed carefully, wearing the same modest dress she had worn during the initial custody hearing. She had washed it the night before, smoothing out every crease as though each wrinkle could be interpreted as carelessness. Her hands trembled as she pulled her hair into a low bun. She didn't want pity. She wanted strength, but she wasn't sure she could summon it again. Evan noticed, quietly stepped behind her, and rested a steadying hand on her back as she looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror. "You're not alone today," he said. She met his eyes in the mirror and nodded. Just that. A nod. But it was enough to get her moving. At the courthouse, the energy was different from the previous hearing. It was heavier, more formal. This time, the focus was on Greg, on his record, his behavior, his threats, and his history. Rachel's attorney, bolstered by the recent work of Evan's legal team and the reports from Detective Harris, stood with renewed confidence. They had spent the last several days compiling statements from past neighbors, screenshots of threatening texts, and testimony from a former girlfriend of Greg's who had come forward after hearing about the case in the news. Everything was finally converging. Rachel sat at the plaintiff's table, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Evan sat directly behind her with Sophie on his left and Lucy on his right, drawing quietly on a notepad with colored pencils Rachel had packed in her purse. The girls weren't called to testify this time. Evan had insisted they be present only as a symbol of unity and protection, not as pawns in a courtroom. The judge allowed it under the condition that they remained quiet and were removed if the proceedings became too intense. Greg walked in last, smug in a dark navy suit, flanked by a high-priced attorney who had tried, more than once, to settle this quietly. But the public scrutiny had made that impossible. Too many people were watching now, and Greg's mask of control began to slip even before he reached the defense table. His confidence faltered when he saw Evan there, calm and immovable. He faltered again when he caught Rachel's eyes, no longer full of fear, but determination. The hearing began with statements from both legal teams. Rachel's side focused on the pattern of coercion and emotional abuse, and they were backed by hard evidence now. A neighbor who had been too afraid to speak earlier had submitted a sworn statement, describing the sounds of yelling, objects breaking, and Rachel sobbing late into the night. Greg's text messages were displayed on a screen, some filled with insults, others with manipulation. In one, he threatened to take Lucy and raise her to forget you ever existed. Then came the most impactful moment of the hearing. Detective Harris took the stand. Calm and methodical, he walked the court through the timeline of complaints against Greg, focusing on the missed red flags, the closed cases, and the disturbing consistency of Greg's behavior across multiple relationships. Greg's lawyer attempted to discredit the testimonies. He pointed out that no criminal charges had ever stuck, that Rachel had remained in the relationship for years, and that Evan's sudden reappearance as a father was suspiciously convenient. But none of it worked. The judge, experienced and sharp, saw through it. She interrupted at one point, raising an eyebrow as she looked directly at Greg. "So what you're telling this court is that in every one of these unrelated cases, multiple women, different cities, the problem was them, and not you?" Greg's mouth opened, but he didn't respond fast enough. The silence said more than words. In her final statement, Rachel stood on shaky legs, refusing her attorney's offer to speak on her behalf. She looked directly at the judge, then down at Lucy, then Sophie. "I'm not perfect," she began. "I've made mistakes. I stayed when I should have left. I believe things I shouldn't have. But I never stopped protecting my girls. I carried the fear every day. I gave up everything to keep them safe, even if it meant letting them go. And I'm standing here now, not because I think I'm better than him, but because I know what love is supposed to feel like. And my daughters, they deserve that kind of love. Not fear." Silence filled the courtroom as she stepped back. The judge didn't respond immediately. She looked down at the papers in front of her, then up at the faces in the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. This court finds that Greg Bennett poses a credible threat to the safety and emotional well-being of both minors. His petition for custody is denied permanently. A restraining order is hereby extended for a period of 5 years. The court recognizes Evan Miller and Rachel Carson as joint legal guardians of Sophie Miller and Lucy Carson effective immediately. Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She turned, and before she could say anything, Sophie jumped up and hugged her. Lucy followed a moment later, pressing her face into Rachel's side. Evan stood, not saying a word, just placing a protective arm around all three of them. Greg sat still at the table, red-faced, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. But no one paid him attention anymore. His time was over. Outside the courthouse, the sky had finally begun to clear. Rachel stood on the steps, the girls on either side of her, and Evan just behind, watching quietly. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future wasn't uncertain. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Rachel turned to Evan. Her voice was quiet, but full. "I don't know what happens next," she said. He smiled. "We write it." And together, they walked away, not just from the courthouse, but from the shadow that had followed them for years. Summer arrived slowly, as if even the weather understood the family needed time to breathe. After the final hearing, after the courtroom doors closed and Greg Bennett's shadow was finally behind them, the days began to unfold differently. It wasn't dramatic. No parades or fairy tale endings. Just quiet change. Healing, slow and stubborn, took root not in grand gestures but in the subtle softness of everyday life. Evan's once sterile penthouse began to truly transform, not just physically, but emotionally. The sharp edges of glass and metal were now softened by blankets tossed over the couch, small socks in the laundry, coloring books on the floor. The scent of pancakes or soup often replaced the sterile echo of catered meals. Rachel began to reclaim her rhythm. At first she moved through the apartment as if on borrowed time, unsure if she belonged, still carrying years of fear that it would all be ripped away. But Evan never wavered. He gave her space when she needed it, support when she asked for none, and quiet understanding in the moments when words failed her. The girls thrived. Lucy began to laugh again, real, careless laughter. She danced in the hallway, made up songs with wild, wonderful lyrics, and demanded bedtime stories with dragons and cupcakes and outer space. Sophie, who had grown so used to being the protector, finally allowed herself to be a child. She began sleeping through the night, stopped checking the locks before bed, and started asking Rachel if she could have friends over. Her eyes, once always scanning for danger, now lit up at the mention of ice cream or Saturday movies. Rachel enrolled both girls in school for the fall. Lucy would start preschool, and Sophie would begin second grade. They visited the school together as a family. Evan came too, wearing a button-up shirt with no tie and sneakers instead of dress shoes, something Sophie teased him about for an entire day. One morning, just a few weeks after the court ruling, Evan found himself sitting on the floor with Lucy on his shoulders, Sophie braiding Rachel's hair, and laughter echoing through the apartment like it had lived there all along. It hit him then, not as a sudden epiphany, but as something quietly undeniable: this was home. Not the one he built with glass and steel, but the one forged through chaos and pain and unwavering choice. One night, after the girls had gone to sleep and the apartment had fallen into a deep hush, Rachel stood on the balcony watching the lights of the city. Evan joined her, leaning on the railing beside her. They said nothing for a while. The air was warm, the hum of traffic distant. She turned to him slowly. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "Missing those years," he replied. "Yes. I think I always will. But I don't regret showing up when it counted." She nodded. "I used to think I ruined everything. By keeping Sophie from you. By getting involved with Greg. I thought if I stayed quiet, I could contain the damage. Evan looked at her then, not with blame or anger, but with that steady gaze he'd given her the first day she returned. "You survived it," he said. "And you saved them. You gave them the best of you, even when you had nothing left." Rachel blinked quickly and smiled in a way that was more grateful than happy. "I don't know how to live without fear yet." "Then we live with it," he said simply. "But we live." As weeks turned to months, the apartment turned into a real home. Not a temporary shelter, not a legal arrangement, but a place filled with routines and rituals that only made sense to them. Sunday pancakes became tradition. Friday movie nights with popcorn and mismatched pajamas were non-negotiable. They took turns burning dinner and laughing about it. Lucy once spilled juice on a contract Evan had brought home. He framed the page instead of throwing it out. On Sophie's 8th birthday, Rachel baked a lopsided chocolate cake that the girls declared the best in the universe. Evan gave Sophie a necklace with her name engraved next to the word brave. She wore it every day. There were still hard days. Rachel had panic attacks sometimes, triggered by sounds or sudden silence. Sophie occasionally woke up crying. Lucy had moments where she asked, in her small voice, if Greg would come back. But those moments passed, and they passed together. No one had to carry them alone anymore. One quiet evening, while tucking Lucy into bed, Rachel found her holding a drawing. It showed 4 stick figures, 2 adults, 2 kids. All were holding hands. Over the picture, in large, uneven letters, Lucy had written, *, my family. *. Rachel showed it to Evan later, her hands trembling. He didn't say much. He just held the paper, then held her. That was the thing about this story. It didn't end in applause or fireworks. It ended in something better. In safety. In love rebuilt. In everyday miracles. And in the quiet, steady truth that family is not always about blood or timing or perfection. Sometimes, it's about choosing to stay. Choosing to show up. Choosing to begin again. And in that choice, they had found something lasting. Not just survival, but home. What makes the ending of this story powerful isn't that everything turns out perfectly, but that it turns out honestly. It's not a fairy tale, and that's what gives it real emotional weight. The characters don't simply erase their pain, they learn to live with it, to grow from it, and to choose love and healing every single day, even when it's hard. For me, the most meaningful part is how the story shows that family isn't defined by the beginning, it's defined by what you do when it counts. Evan didn't know he had a daughter, and Rachel made mistakes out of fear and survival, but when it mattered most, they showed up. Not with perfection, but with presence. And sometimes, that's more than enough. The final image, Lucy's drawing, 4 figures holding hands, labeled simply, my family, says everything. In the end, it's not about getting back what was lost. It's about building something new, something chosen, and something that lasts. That's the kind of ending that stays with you. He hadn't seen his daughter since she was 1 year old, until she showed up at his office holding 2 babies and said, "My brothers need milk." It was a cloudy Thursday afternoon in New York City, and James Harper was just stepping out of his sleek black SUV in front of his corporate headquarters. As the CEO of one of the most powerful real estate firms on the East Coast, his days were typically packed with meetings, negotiations, and numbers. He was dressed sharply in a light gray suit, his tie undone slightly as he checked his phone, scrolling through unread messages. The wind tugged at his jacket as he approached the entrance of the building, nodding briefly to the doorman. Then he saw her. A little girl stood just a few steps from the revolving doors, holding something, holding someone, in her small arms. 2 tiny bundles wrapped in matching blue blankets. Her hair was dark, like his, long and slightly tangled, and her big blue eyes stared at him with a strange mixture of recognition and fear. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She wore a bright yellow t-shirt, a blue skirt that looked worn at the edges, and shoes that didn't quite match. Her arms trembled from the weight of the babies she carried, but she didn't put them down. At first, James assumed it was some tragic misunderstanding. A lost child? A desperate situation? A prank, even? But the moment she opened her mouth, the world around him stopped. "My brothers want milk," she said quietly, almost apologetically. James froze. For a second, he couldn't speak. His heart dropped to his stomach as he looked into her face again. Something shifted in him, something that had been buried for 6 long years. The last time he had seen his daughter, she had been barely a year old, reaching for him with tiny fingers as her mother walked away without a word. He had spent years wondering where they went, searching at first, then grieving, assuming they had built a new life without him. And now this little girl stood in front of him, unmistakably familiar. The same eyes. The same shape of the mouth. Even her stubborn posture reminded him of the baby he once rocked to sleep. He blinked, trying to find his voice. You're my daughter?" he asked, the words sticking in his throat. She looked at him, not with confusion, but with something closer to defiance. "Mom said you died," she said matter-of-factly, her grip tightening around the babies. "But I saw your face on the side of a building. I thought maybe it wasn't true." James didn't know what to say. His thoughts were racing. Was this really her? Could it be? And who were the babies she held so protectively? Her brothers? His sons? The questions made his head spin, but he knew one thing for certain: the little girl in front of him was not just someone's child. She was his. People began to slow down on the sidewalk, glancing over at the strange scene unfolding outside the pristine glass office building. James stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Let's get you inside," he said gently. "You and your brothers. We'll go to the hospital, make sure you're all okay." The girl looked skeptical. "Why would you help us?" James hesitated, then crouched slightly to meet her eyes. "Because I think I'm your dad." She studied him. Her lip quivered, just for a second, then she looked down at the sleeping infants in her arms. Finally, she gave a tiny nod. "Okay," she whispered. And just like that, James Harper's entire life changed. James helped the girl into the back seat of his car, gently placing the twin infants into soft blankets on the leather seats. He buckled them in with more care than he had used in years, his hands slightly trembling. She sat silently beside them, her little legs barely hanging over the edge, her arms folded tightly across her chest as if to guard herself. He didn't ask her name yet. He wasn't ready to hear it out loud, not until he was sure. Instead, he focused on driving, weaving through the busy Manhattan streets, his mind racing faster than the car. He kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror. She stared out the window, her expression unreadable. He wanted to ask her so many things, but he knew not to push. She had shown up out of nowhere with 2 babies in her arms, believing her father had died, and now she was in a stranger's car because he had offered her milk and safety. It was too much for anyone, let alone a 6-year-old. And yet, she sat there in complete silence, like someone who had already lived through more than she ever should have. Finally, as they stopped at a red light, James cleared his throat. "Do they have names?" he asked softly, glancing again at the bundles. She turned her eyes to him. "Daniel and David," she replied without hesitation. "Daniel's the one who cries when he's hungry. David always goes second." Her voice was low, like someone reciting instructions rather than sharing something personal. He nodded slowly. "They're lucky to have you." The girl didn't respond, just went back to looking out the window. James gripped the steering wheel tighter. They arrived at the hospital 15 minutes later. It wasn't the closest, but it was the one he trusted: private, efficient, quiet. He carried one baby, she carried the other, and together they walked through the sliding glass doors. Nurses looked up in confusion as the powerful CEO of Harper & Blake, someone they recognized from business news channels, walked in carrying a baby and accompanied by a mysterious child. The attending pediatrician, Dr. Sarah Evans, was paged immediately. James had known her for years through charity work and trusted her more than anyone. Within minutes, they were in a private room. The babies were placed on warmed beds, checked by gentle hands, fed, and stabilized. They were slightly dehydrated, underfed, but otherwise healthy. James sat in the corner of the room, watching the little girl sit on the chair with her feet tucked underneath her. She didn't look at the toys offered by the nurse or the juice box placed beside her. Her attention was focused only on the babies. The way her eyes followed every movement, the way she stiffened every time one of them cried, it was like watching a soldier guard her last post. When the babies had been fed and were asleep, Dr. Evans stepped out with James into the hallway. She said her name is Lily, the doctor said quietly. Is she? James swallowed hard. I think so. I lost her 6 years ago. Her mother left and disappeared. I haven't seen her since. Dr. Evans's eyes softened. Do you want to do a DNA test? He nodded. Yes. As soon as possible. And one for the twins. I don't know anything for sure. She gave a slight nod. I'll take care of it. Back inside the room, Lily was sitting exactly as they had left her. When James walked in, she didn't look up. Her face was expressionless. Lily, he said carefully, crouching down so he was eye level with her, I want to make sure you're okay. I want to help your brothers, and I want to help you too. Her voice was flat. You said you were my dad. James felt a sharp ache in his chest. I said I think I am. I haven't seen you since you were a baby. Your mom left. I didn't know where you were. I didn't know if you were alive. She said you died in a crash, Lily replied, her gaze still fixed on the babies. That's why I didn't look for you. I thought you were gone forever. He didn't know how to respond to that. What do you say to a child who believed you were dead? I didn't die, he said finally. I'm here. I'm real. And if you'll let me, I want to prove that you're not alone anymore. Lily slowly turned to him then. There was doubt in her eyes. A wall of it. And hurt too, so much hurt for someone so young. Are you going to take us away? She asked, her voice trembling for the first time. James shook his head. No. I'm going to take care of you. And I want to find out the truth. But we'll do it together. No surprises. No lies. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, with a small nod, she whispered, okay. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something. A beginning. The next morning, the hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional gurgle from one of the babies sleeping nearby. The early sunlight filtered through the half-drawn blinds, casting a warm golden hue across the floor. James had barely slept. He had spent most of the night sitting on the small couch in the corner of the room, watching over the children, over his children, perhaps. His mind was in chaos. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lily's face from the day before, her cautious stare, her tired voice, her arms wrapped around the twins like a shield. Lily had fallen asleep in the armchair next to the baby's crib, one leg curled under her, her head leaning against the side of the chair. She didn't look like a child should look. There was no peace in her sleep. Her face twitched sometimes, as though even her dreams didn't offer rest. James looked at her and felt something deep and painful stir inside him. Guilt. Guilt so sharp it made his chest ache. He hadn't left her. He hadn't abandoned her. But she had lived as if he had. That was something he couldn't ignore. Dr. Evans entered the room quietly, holding a clipboard in one hand and a small sealed envelope in the other. She gave James a look that said she was ready to speak, but her eyes flicked toward the sleeping girl, and she kept her voice low. "The test results are back," she said, and James stood up immediately, crossing the room to meet her just outside the door. In the hallway, she handed him the envelope. He stared at it for a second before opening it. The document was clear, precise, clinical in its wording. The child known as Lily Harper matched his DNA with 99.9% certainty. The twins, Daniel and David, were not biologically his. That didn't surprise him. But what stunned him was how quickly, how instinctively, he had come to care for them anyway. "She's yours," Dr. Evans said softly. "There's no doubt." James stared at the paper for a moment longer, then slowly folded it and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He felt a strange rush of emotion, relief, disbelief, sorrow, joy, all mixing into something so overwhelming that he couldn't speak for a full minute. "She's been through more than most adults," the doctor continued, her voice filled with quiet concern. "She told the nurse a little more while we were doing the test. Said their mother left a few days ago. Just left them all in the apartment. She tried to feed the babies with water and sugar. Walked to the store to ask for milk. No one helped her. Then she saw your face on a billboard." James blinked. "What?" "She saw your photo on one of those luxury development ads near Times Square. You were standing in front of a new high-rise. That's how she knew your name wasn't dead." His chest tightened. The idea of his daughter wandering through the city, carrying 2 infants, searching for food and chasing the face of a man she'd been told was gone, it was almost too much to bear. "I need to talk to her," he said, his voice low. Dr. Evans nodded. "She's awake now." When James walked back into the room, Lily was sitting up. She wasn't holding the babies, but her eyes were on them as if she could protect them by will alone. She looked at James warily, sensing the change in the air. "Did you find out?" she asked without preamble. James sat on the edge of the couch, not too close, but close enough to be near. "Yes. I did." Lily nodded slowly. "So? Are you really my dad?" "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "You're my daughter, Lily. You always have been." For a second, her expression didn't change. Then something cracked just slightly in her eyes, relief, fear, confusion. It flickered and vanished just as quickly. "But what about the boys?" she asked, already shifting the attention away from herself. "They need food. They need a home." "We'll get them everything they need," James said gently. "We'll find a way, Lily. But first, I need you to know that you're not alone anymore. I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." Lily stared at him for a long time. Her fingers twisted together in her lap, her mouth pulled into a tight line. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost inaudible. "Mom said you died. She told me after she had the babies. I didn't believe her at first. But then she showed me a newspaper. I was little. I didn't know how to check anything." James felt a sharp sting behind his eyes, but he didn't let it show. "I didn't die, Lily. I never stopped hoping I'd find you. I just didn't know where to look." She looked away. "I didn't know where to look either. Until I saw your face." There was a long silence between them, filled only by the quiet breathing of the sleeping babies. Then James stood and walked over to her. He held out his hand, not to force her, but to offer something. "I know you don't have any reason to trust me yet," he said quietly. "But if you let me, I want to show you that you can." She looked at his hand, then at his face, and for a moment it seemed like she might retreat again. But instead, she slowly reached out and took it. It was the smallest of gestures, but it was everything. James didn't leave the hospital for the rest of the day. He cancelled every meeting, ignored calls from business partners, and asked his assistant to handle everything without bothering him unless it was life or death. The man who had built a reputation for being unreachable and relentlessly focused on success was now spending hours sitting beside a small girl and 2 infants, feeding them, comforting them, and trying to understand how his life had taken such an unexpected, irreversible turn. Lily remained cautious, even after hearing the truth. She never asked to be held, never reached for his hand again, but she also didn't pull away when he helped her open a juice box or gently brushed her hair out of her eyes. She stayed near the babies constantly, even insisting on changing their diapers despite the nurse's offers to help. It became clear to James very quickly that Lily had become their caregiver out of necessity, not choice. The way she moved, the way she watched everyone who came near the boys, it was protective, almost parental. That realization hit him harder than any business failure ever had. She had raised them, at least for as long as their mother had been gone, and probably even before that. James sat down next to her on the edge of the hospital bed that afternoon while the twins were napping. He brought a tray with sandwiches and soup, but Lily barely touched hers. She just looked at the food, her hands in her lap. "How long was she gone before you came to find me?" he asked gently, not wanting to press too hard but needing to understand. Lily shrugged, her gaze fixed on the floor. "She was sick a lot. She'd sleep all day. Sometimes not come home for days. I learned how to mix formula when the babies were little. Then we ran out. I tried water, but they kept crying. One night, she just didn't come back." James felt his throat tighten. The idea of a 6-year-old trying to figure out how to feed 2 infants alone, waiting for a mother who had already emotionally vanished, was unbearable. "Did you tell anyone? A neighbor? Someone at school?" he asked. "I stopped going to school when the babies were born," she said plainly. "I couldn't leave them alone. The lady downstairs yelled at me for crying too much. One man gave me crackers once. But no one wanted to get involved." James pressed his hand against his mouth, trying to hold back the frustration boiling inside. It wasn't just Emily's disappearance that had hurt Lily, it was the silence from the world around her. The way people had looked the other way. "You shouldn't have had to do any of that," he finally said, his voice raw. "That's not what a child should live through." Lily didn't respond. She just shifted her weight on the bed and looked over at the twins. "They're good babies," she whispered. "They don't deserve to be alone." James looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone far older than her years. A child who had stopped being a child too soon. He realized that winning her trust wouldn't be about grand promises or gifts. It would be about showing up, every single day, and proving he meant every word. That night, James asked the hospital staff to bring in a cot so he could sleep in the room with them. They protested. He was, after all, a high-profile public figure, but he insisted. He lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, watching the moonlight stretch across the floor, thinking about what kind of life Lily must have lived while he'd been in boardrooms and luxury hotels. He thought about the moments he had missed, her first steps, her first words, her first scraped knee, her first fear. He would never get those years back. But he could be there now. He could fight for her now. In the quiet darkness, one of the babies stirred and whimpered softly. Lily sat up instantly, almost before James could even react, and crossed the room to soothe him. She moved automatically, like it was second nature. James rose as well and came to stand beside her. "You don't have to do it alone anymore," he whispered, reaching to help. "Let me take care of them too." Lily hesitated for just a second, then handed him the baby. He took the tiny boy into his arms. "Daniel," he thought, and rocked him gently. The baby quieted after a moment, nestling into James's shoulder. Lily watched him, her expression unreadable. But she didn't take the baby back. That was enough. For now. 3 days passed. James hadn't returned to his office, not even once. His assistant kept forwarding urgent emails, board members called to demand explanations, and one investor threatened to pull out of a deal unless James made a public appearance. But none of it mattered to him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about buildings or deadlines. He was thinking about Lily. About the twins. About Emily, and where she might be. Every night, he lay awake wondering how things had gone so far off course without him ever knowing. How had he not seen it coming? How had she disappeared so completely? Dr. Evans had arranged for the hospital's social services department to assist, and though James appreciated the help, he quickly made it clear that he would take full responsibility for the children. Legally, Lily was his daughter, and he now had temporary custody granted within hours due to his status and the emergency circumstances. As for the twins, the paperwork was more complicated. They were not his biological sons, but there was no one else. Their mother had vanished, no extended family had come forward, and Lily had made it clear that wherever she went, they would go too. That, for James, wasn't even a question. He had already made up his mind. On the fourth morning, just as he was preparing to take the children home from the hospital, Dr. Evans approached him with an envelope in her hand. She looked tired, but there was something intense in her eyes, something James couldn't quite name until she spoke. One of the nurses remembered something, she said, handing him the envelope. Apparently, a woman came into the ER almost 2 weeks ago. No ID, disoriented, high fever, severe pneumonia. She left before being fully treated. The nurse didn't think much of it, until she saw Lily. They matched her face to a photo. James took the envelope slowly and opened it. Inside was a printed photograph, slightly grainy, clearly taken from hospital security footage. His breath caught. It was Emily. Her face was thinner than he remembered, her eyes sunken, her skin pale and sweaty, but there was no mistaking it. His heart lurched painfully in his chest. She had been there. She had been so close. And still, she hadn't called him. "Do you know where she went?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "We traced her to a shelter across town. She checked in under a false name and left again a few days later. But we think we can find her. One of our social workers is already reaching out." James stood there for a long time, staring at the photo in his hand. He couldn't stop thinking about what she must have felt in those moments. Fear? Shame? Regret? She had been sick. She had been alone. And yet, she hadn't trusted him enough to reach out, not even when she knew she was leaving their daughter and 2 newborns behind. The pain of that realization struck deep, almost deeper than the initial abandonment. Later that afternoon, when the children were finally discharged and James brought them to his penthouse apartment, Lily barely said a word. She looked out the window of the car the entire ride, her small fingers clutching the strap of her seatbelt. James didn't push her. He knew she was holding too much inside. His home was large, modern, full of quiet and space and light. It had been designed to impress clients, to entertain guests, to reflect success. It had never been meant for children. But now, as he carried one of the twins through the glass front doors, followed by a silent Lily with the other in her arms, the entire apartment felt like a blank page. Something new. Something waiting to be rewritten. James had a crib delivered before they arrived, along with baby supplies, clothes, bottles, diapers, toys, and everything else the hospital staff had recommended. Still, Lily insisted on sleeping in the same room as the babies. She didn't trust the unfamiliar comfort. She didn't trust silence. She kept asking for a nightlight, not for herself, but for the twins. That night, after everyone had fallen asleep, James stayed up in his office, staring at the photo of Emily again. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder he hadn't touched in years. It held the last things he'd had from her, an old phone bill, a copy of a missing persons report he'd filed, a photo of them together before Lily was born. She had looked so full of life back then. Bright eyes. Bold laughter. He remembered how she used to dance barefoot in the living room. How she used to draw little hearts on Lily's lunchbox napkins. He wondered when all of that had disappeared. Had it happened slowly, day by day, or had she just broken all at once? Then, tucked deep inside the folder, he found something he hadn't noticed before. A small envelope with his name written on it in her handwriting. James. His fingers shook slightly as he opened it. The letter was short. Just a few lines. But every word sliced through him. I'm sorry I'm doing this to you. I'm not okay, James. I haven't been for a long time. I know I should tell you, but I can't. I'm ashamed. I don't want Lily to see me like this. I don't want you to see me like this. You don't deserve this version of me. If you're reading this, I failed to make it right. I just hope someday you can forgive me. The date was 6 months ago. Which meant she had planned to leave long before she actually disappeared. James sat there for a long time, the letter trembling in his hand. He didn't cry, not exactly. But something cracked open inside him, a deep, old grief that had never been given a proper place to land. He had lost her once. And now, if they didn't find her soon, he might lose her again, this time for good. But this time, he wasn't going to stop searching. This time, he wasn't going to wait. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, though it was unlike anything James Harper had ever known. The man who once flew between time zones without thinking twice, who lived on coffee, boardroom adrenaline, and high-stakes deals, now woke up to bottle-feed 2 infants and coax a guarded 6-year-old into eating breakfast. His mornings were spent in pajamas, not suits. Instead of reviewing contracts, he learned how to measure formula, soothe colic, and locate pacifiers in the middle of the night. And still, in between diapers and lullabies, a silent, gnawing question clung to the back of his mind: where was Emily? Lily spoke more now, but only in small pieces. She remained watchful, her every move anchored to the well-being of her brothers. She still insisted on sharing their room, still flinched slightly when someone knocked on the door too loud, still hesitated whenever James offered too much. He didn't take it personally. He understood that trust, for Lily, had become something like a myth, something she wanted to believe in but had no real reason to. One evening, after the twins had finally settled and the apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen, James found Lily sitting alone on the floor of the nursery. Her knees were pulled to her chest, and she was holding a small stuffed bear that one of the hospital nurses had given her. She didn't notice him at first. Her eyes were fixed on the carpet, unmoving. He approached slowly, lowering himself to the floor beside her without saying a word at first. She didn't shift or back away, but her shoulders tensed just slightly. "Do you ever miss her?" she asked, her voice flat, almost too casual, like she was asking about the weather. James didn't answer right away. He looked at the bear, at the dim nightlight casting shadows across the wall, at the girl who was trying not to feel too much. "I miss her every day," he said finally. "But I miss the version of her that smiled. The one who used to draw on napkins and sneak extra cookies into your lunchbox. I think maybe, that version of her went missing a long time ago." Lily didn't say anything for a while. Then she asked, "Do you think she meant to leave? Or did she just get tired?" James turned to her, hearing the heaviness in her words, the adult sadness of someone far too young to carry it. "I think she was very sick," he said softly. "Not in a way you can see, like a cold. But in her mind. Her heart. Sometimes people carry pain so heavy, they don't know how to ask for help. And when it gets too heavy, they run." "Do you think she still loves me?" Lily asked. Her voice cracked on the last word. James's chest tightened, and he reached out slowly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I know she does. I think leaving you was the hardest thing she ever did. But I think she believed it was the only thing she could do." And I think she was wrong. Lily didn't cry, but her bottom lip trembled slightly. Then she did something that surprised him. She leaned against his side, not fully hugging him, but resting there. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just let her stay there as long as she needed. That night marked a shift between them. James began involving Lily in more decisions: what to feed the twins, how to decorate the nursery, which bedtime story to read. And she responded. Slowly, carefully, she started acting more like a child than a caretaker. She even laughed once, really laughed, when one of the babies spit up on James's shirt during a feeding. It was the kind of sound that made his eyes sting unexpectedly. Meanwhile, James had hired a team of investigators, sparing no expense to find Emily. He wanted to believe she was still alive, that she could be found before it was too late. He had someone combing through shelters, hospitals, street footage, and even the online corners where people went when they had no identification and nowhere left to run. Every night, he updated Lily with whatever he knew, careful not to make promises he couldn't keep. He told her only the truth, when they had a lead, when they didn't, when he felt hopeful and when he didn't. She appreciated that more than false reassurances. Then, on the 11th day since Lily had walked into his life again, the phone call came. It was past midnight. The apartment was quiet. James had just finished cleaning the kitchen and was about to turn in for the night when his phone buzzed. He answered immediately, recognizing the number. "We found her," the voice on the other end said. A woman matching Emily's description was admitted to a county hospital 2 hours ago. She was picked up in bad condition, but stable. She gave her real name at intake. "She's asking for her daughter." James barely heard the rest of the words. He was already grabbing his keys, his mind racing. He thought about waking Lily, but then he paused. What if Emily wasn't ready? What if she changed her mind? What if she saw her daughter and couldn't handle it? He called Dr. Evans first, asking her to meet him there. Then he left a note for Lily, just in case she woke up, and headed out into the night. At the hospital, the halls were cold and sterile. Nurses led him to a private room at the far end of the recovery wing. Emily lay there, pale, thin, her eyes sunken, her hair tangled around her face. But when she looked up and saw him, her expression cracked open in a way he hadn't seen in years. There was pain there, and shame, but also relief. "I didn't think you'd come," she whispered. "I never stopped looking," he said. She reached for his hand with shaking fingers, and in that moment, he saw not the woman who had left, but the woman who had once danced barefoot in his kitchen. Broken, yes. But not gone. "I want to see her," Emily said. "I want to see Lily. If she'll let me." James nodded slowly. "We'll take it one step at a time." But he knew, deep in his chest, that this was the beginning of another kind of return. Not just for Emily, but for all of them. James didn't bring Lily to the hospital right away. After seeing Emily that night, weak but lucid, trembling but coherent, he knew rushing the reunion would do more harm than good. Emily herself had asked for time. She wanted to see Lily more than anything, but she was terrified that her daughter would look at her with hatred, or worse, pity. James understood. The woman lying in that hospital bed was a shadow of the Emily he had known, but somewhere beneath the exhaustion and regret, he saw the flickers of the woman who had once loved fiercely and laughed easily. He saw a mother who had fallen, but who was trying, desperately, to stand back up. Over the next few days, James visited Emily regularly. He brought photos of the children, updates from the pediatrician, and drawings Lily had made. He didn't tell Lily yet that her mother had been found, not until he was sure Emily was truly stable, physically and mentally. Each time he sat by her hospital bed, she asked about Lily, about the twins, about what they ate, how they slept, whether they still cried at night. She cried when she saw the picture of Daniel curled up on a soft blanket, holding his brother's hand in his sleep. She cried harder when she saw Lily's shaky attempt at writing her name in crayon, the letters uneven but full of quiet strength. "I abandoned them," Emily whispered during one visit, unable to meet his eyes. "I thought I was protecting them from me, but I left them to suffer. I told myself you were better off without me, but I lied. I was scared, James. I didn't know how to be the person you both needed me to be. I broke inside, and then I let it spread to everything around me." James didn't pretend to understand all of it. He didn't offer easy forgiveness. But he listened. He stayed. And in doing so, he gave her what she needed most, someone who didn't run. When he finally told Lily that her mother had been found, he sat beside her on the floor of the nursery, the twins sleeping nearby, and explained everything carefully. He didn't lie. He didn't soften it too much. He told her that her mother had been sick, and afraid, and that she had made choices that hurt people, but that she wanted to see her now, if Lily wanted to. Lily didn't say anything at first. She looked down at her knees, her fingers picking at a loose thread on her pajama pants. Then she whispered, "Is she still sick?" James nodded gently. "Not like before. But she's still healing." Lily looked up at him then, her blue eyes searching his face. "Will she leave again?" "I don't think so," he answered honestly. "But I can't promise what the future holds. I can promise she loves you. That she never stopped." Lily didn't cry. She didn't jump up or run out the door. Instead, she sat there in silence for a long time. And then, finally, she said, "Okay. I want to see her. But only if the babies come too." James smiled softly. "Of course." The reunion happened 2 days later in a private hospital room filled with too much sunlight and too much emotion to fit into any single moment. Emily sat in a chair, a blanket over her lap, her hands clenched so tightly they trembled. Lily entered slowly, holding one car seat in each hand, her small arms straining under the weight, her jaw set in a line of quiet determination. James walked behind her, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of distress. Emily's eyes filled with tears the moment she saw her daughter. She stood, shakily, and took a single step forward, but stopped herself. Lily stared at her for a long time, saying nothing. Her face didn't show joy or anger or fear, it was blank, unreadable, as if her heart couldn't decide which emotion to land on first. Then she placed the car seats on the ground, unbuckled Daniel and David with practiced hands, and gently picked one up. She held him close, looked at her mother, and said simply, "This is Daniel. He's the one who cries a lot. David's the quiet one. He likes music." Emily's mouth trembled as she nodded, stepping closer. "They're beautiful," she whispered. Lily didn't answer right away. But after a moment, she handed Daniel to her mother. Emily took him as if he were made of glass, her arms unsure, her body shaking. The baby blinked up at her, then reached out one small hand to tug at her hair. That was all it took. Emily broke into silent tears, holding him like he was a lifeline. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, over and over, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry, Lily. I'm so sorry." Lily stood there, watching her mother cry, holding her other brother close to her chest. And finally, quietly, she said, "Okay." She didn't say, "I forgive you." Not yet. But the word "okay" was more than enough. It was permission. It was a start. The nurses gave them space. James watched from the doorway as his fractured family, tired, bruised, but still standing, took the first fragile steps toward becoming whole again. He didn't know what would come next. Therapy, probably. Hard conversations. Maybe even more setbacks. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that the hardest part was over. They had found each other again. And no one would be letting go this time. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it settled over the city like a promise. The trees along the avenue outside James's apartment bloomed with white blossoms that blew like snow whenever the wind shifted. Birds nested on windowsills, sunlight lingered longer across the hardwood floors, and for the first time in a long while, James felt like the air itself had softened. It had been 3 months since the day Lily walked into his life again. 3 months since he had held his daughter for the first time in years and whispered to her that she was no longer alone. So much had changed in those weeks that James sometimes forgot what his life used to be. His schedule no longer revolved around stockholders or development contracts. He no longer started his mornings with conference calls or closed his evenings with brandy and silence. Now, his days began with soft crying from the nursery and the smell of oatmeal burning slightly on the stove. Now, he ended his nights with storybooks, warm bottles, and quiet conversations with a little girl who still hadn't completely learned how to trust but who, slowly, was starting to try. Emily was released from the hospital after nearly 4 weeks of monitored care. She had moved into a private recovery facility not far from James's building, a place with quiet gardens and therapists who understood the damage that couldn't always be seen on scans. She and Lily met often, at first only with James present, then alone in short sessions, and eventually for entire afternoons in the nearby park. Their conversations were not always easy. Sometimes Lily said nothing at all. Sometimes she asked questions that Emily wasn't ready to answer. But there were also moments, soft, unexpected ones, when they laughed over ice cream or when Emily rocked David to sleep and hummed an old lullaby without realizing she remembered the tune. James never pushed. He gave them space, offered support, and made sure Lily always had the choice to step away if she needed to. What surprised him most was how Lily never did. She stayed. Even in her quietest moments, she showed up. She brought pictures she'd drawn to show her mother. She described the baby's different cries with the precision of someone who had studied them like a language. She once brought Emily a scarf James didn't know she'd kept from their old apartment, a faded thing with tiny yellow stars that used to belong to Emily, now clutched in Lily's small hands like a piece of something lost and found. The twins were thriving. With proper care and love, they had gained weight, found their voices, and learned to smile. They had different personalities, just as Lily had said. Daniel was loud, expressive, and impatient. David was quiet, observant, and calm. Watching them grow became the quiet heartbeat of every day in the Harper home. James, once terrified to hold a bottle correctly, had become a master of midnight feedings and diaper changes. His suits hung untouched in his closet. His boardroom had become the kitchen table, where he read fairy tales and taught Lily how to count in French just because she'd asked once. The apartment had transformed too. There were colorful drawings taped to the fridge, a high chair beside the dining table, baby blankets draped over the back of the leather couch. Lily's laughter echoed down the hallway now, sometimes joined by Emily's softer voice, sometimes by the twins' gurgling giggles. And somehow, all the space that had once felt so painfully empty now felt barely big enough to hold the noise and life it contained. James didn't return to work full-time. Instead, he delegated more, stepped back, and allowed his company to run without him constantly at the wheel. He realized, slowly and without regret, that he no longer needed the rush of power to feel alive. He had something far more fragile and infinitely more meaningful, a family. Not perfect, not simple, but real. One Sunday afternoon, the sun pouring through the windows, the smell of fresh bread in the air, James found Lily sitting on the balcony with a book open in her lap. She wasn't reading it. She was watching the sky, her eyes tracing the slow drift of clouds overhead. He stepped outside, crouched beside her, and said, "What are you thinking about?" She didn't answer right away. Then she looked at him, serious and thoughtful. "Do you think people can break and still come back together?" He nodded without hesitation. "Yes. I think they can come back even stronger." She looked away again. "Mom said she doesn't know if she deserves to come home." She says maybe she hurt us too much. James reached out, gently tucking a curl behind her ear. It's not about what we deserve. It's about what we choose. We're choosing to build something new. Day by day. Lily nodded, slow and quiet. I want her to come home. I think we're strong enough now. Later that week, Emily moved into the apartment. Not as a guest, not as someone visiting temporarily, but as part of the family. It was an adjustment, awkward at times, tender at others, but real. They carved out new routines. They created new memories. And they forgave, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, every day, with kindness and patience and small, steady gestures. One evening, as the whole family sat in the living room, James on the floor playing with the twins, Emily curled up with a book, Lily stretched across the couch drawing stars on a notepad, Lily looked up suddenly and said, "Dad?" James turned to her immediately. "Yeah, sweetheart?" She smiled, small but real. "I'm glad I found you." He stood, crossed the room, and wrapped his arms around her, gently but firmly, and whispered, "Me too. You saved all of us." Outside, the sky darkened. The city moved on as it always did, fast and loud, but inside the apartment, there was warmth, there was light, and there was love. The kind that didn't erase the past, but wove it into something stronger. Something whole. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by all the pieces of his once broken life, James understood what he hadn't before: some miracles don't come all at once. Some arrive in pieces, painful, beautiful, unexpected, and build themselves in silence until you look around one day and realize you're living inside one. This story, at its heart, is not just about reunion, it's about the quiet, painful process of healing. What moved me most wasn't the dramatic moment Lily appeared with the twins, or even the emotional reunion with Emily, but the slow transformation of each character. The way James let go of control to learn how to love. The way Lily, so young yet already shaped by loss, learned to trust again. And the way Emily, despite her deepest regrets, found the strength to come back and face what she had left behind. It's a story that doesn't pretend healing is easy or that forgiveness happens instantly. Instead, it shows that broken people don't need to be perfect to deserve a second chance. They just need to choose to try, again and again. The beauty of the ending isn't in its neatness, but in its truth. Family isn't about how it starts, or how far it falls apart, but about whether we're willing to rebuild it, even with shaky hands and scars. And in that, this story finds something rare, a happy ending that feels earned.